Okay, hello and welcome to my remarkably less shitty and remarkably less haphazard setup. I'm pretty excited about it, honestly. Before I sort of moved around the house trying to figure out good places to film, but then the other day Sophia came over and we set up this, and I'm very happy about it. So generally as a person, I tend to be pretty utilitarian, and so I'm not good at making areas around me pretty, and so Sophia came over and helped me organize all of this, and I'm very happy. And hopefully I'll be filming a good number of my videos to come from this very location. Yay! Anyways, that was the brief prologue. What I'm here to talk about today is the books that I read in August. I read 7 books in August, which actually I'm pretty proud of, because by the 21st, I think I'd only read 1 book, which means that I read 6 books in the last 10 days. Alright, let's talk about some books. Okay, so the first book I read this month is Hungry Hearts. Hungry Hearts is a fiction anthology by a bunch of different authors, where every author is talking about a different restaurant or family that lives on the street Hungry Hearts Row, with tons and tons of restaurants. I think having food as the common thread between all the stories was super effective, because food is something that every culture has, right? And in this way, even if one story is about 2 Indian kids, and then the next story is about a Latina girl, and then the next one is about a German girl, you kind of have this thread to follow along all these stories that brings them together in a really satisfying way, even though all the authors are so different and all the stories are so different. I think all told, I'd give this anthology probably a 3 out of 5 stars, maybe a 3.5. I think all the stories were really good. I just don't necessarily think any of the stories are going to really strongly stick with me for a long time, so I find it difficult to give it anything higher than a 3 or a 3.5. It started to read a little bit more like YA the further in I got, but I think as far as short story anthology goes, if you want to read a ton of different cultures in one place and a ton of different tones of stories, this is a really effective place to do that. The next book I read this month was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So Daisy Jones and the Six follows this band that really famously broke up in the 1980s, I think, probably. And it's a fictional band, but it's kind of based loosely on Fleetwood Mac, and it's this journalistic take on the story where the story is told through a series of interviews with each of the band members. I could not recommend the audiobook highly enough. I think that's kind of how the story is meant to be digested, because every single character is played by a different actor, and it brings the story to life in a way that, if it's just on page, I don't think it would have been as successful. My favorite thing about this book was how well every single one of the characters was fleshed out and described. You know, even as 2 characters described their hatred for each other, I found myself loving both of them and understanding both of them and understanding their frustrations, but also understanding the other person, which I think can be a really difficult balance to strike, but is a really true to human relationship between people, right? Never between 2 people. If 2 people really dislike each other, it's very rare that one is pure evil and one is pure good. And so this much more complicated, interesting dynamic between people was really effectively done by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I think she did an excellent job with the way she told the story. I would highly recommend the audiobook. I'd probably give this probably 4 stars, honestly. It was just such a good story, and I really enjoyed going through it. I think if you're looking for an entertaining audiobook and for just an entertaining experience in general, Daisy Jones and the Six is an excellent book. I also really happen to like kind of learning about famous people and musicians and stuff like that, and if you're not quite so into that, maybe this isn't the book for you, but personally it definitely satisfied that curiosity in me. The next book I read was also something that I listened to in audiobook format, and that's So Sad Today by Melissa Broder. So Melissa Broder is the woman behind this really famous Twitter account, So Sad Today, and she talks really candidly about depression and anxiety and about the struggles she faces in her personal life. And I think this memoir is just kind of an extension of that, where it's a super raw, honest, completely open account of some of her highest highs and lowest lows. And I, for one, really commend her on that, because the level of honesty she got to in this book is incredible. It's unparalleled. I could not imagine putting so much of myself out there for the entire world to see. That being said, sometimes I felt like maybe it was a little too much. Like, there was a whole section of the book that was just vivid descriptions of sects between her and this other guy, and I could have done without listening to any of that. I did not enjoy that too much, to be honest. However, all of her discussions with body dysmorphia and with drugs and alcohol and with her struggles with sobriety and depression and anxiety and all that, I think was really poignant and beautiful. She told it in a way that didn't feel like, oh, if you do the things that I do, you'll be cured one day. It was like, yeah, this is a constant life struggle, but this is my struggle. And if hearing it makes you feel better, then that's good. If not, then I hope I've entertained you. I don't think I can rate this book. I think it's so raw and vulnerable, and I'm not going to rate her life. It just feels wrong to me. But, if you're looking for a very honest, sometimes too graphic take on depression, anxiety, sobriety, sex, open relationships, marriage, love, life, this is a pretty good book. And the audiobook was narrated by Melissa Broder herself, which was really nice. But I think maybe reading the physical book would be better, just so you can kind of skim parts that get to be a little bit too graphic sometimes. I don't know. That's just me. But yeah. The next book I read was Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. This is a science fiction short story anthology, and I loved this book. I'd probably give it a 5 out of 5 stars, honestly. I think that what's really satisfying in science fiction is when you read something and you're convinced by the fiction that they're telling you, and it starts to feel like science. It almost feels a little bit like you sort of slip into almost reading it as if it's a textbook sometimes, because it feels so true and possible and logical. And I think Chiang does an excellent job of blending fiction with reality and with fiction with real science. And that's something that I think a lot of science fiction writers struggle with. And his deep understanding of science really comes out clear in all of his stories. The second reason I loved it so much is it's one thing to tell interesting science fiction stories. It's another thing entirely to retain those deep philosophical themes and questions. And I think Chiang does a really good job of using that science to continue to drive home his philosophical point in a really subtle and satisfying way. I'm still, a week later thinking about the moral dilemmas that he raised in every single one of his stories. The next book that I read is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Motar. So This Is How You Lose the Time War is about these two warring agencies who are infiltrating the threads of time to try to get different timelines to their desired result. And they're fighting against each other in this constant battle. And it follows Red and Blue, who are agents on opposite ends of this war. And it follows them as they kind of leave letters to each other and talk to each other through different times. And it's a really short novella, and I think it was beautifully written. It's written by two different authors, and I think their voices blend together really beautifully. But the story it told was so interesting. I don't know. Ultimately, I think it became something I didn't love quite as much as how it started. However, just for the concept in general, I would highly recommend reading this book. It's so short, and the way they told the story was so satisfying and interesting that you couldn't help but continue to read. And it kind of felt like this scientific poetry as you were reading it. I don't know how else to describe it. Sometimes I think the prose got a little bit out of hand, where it felt a little bit too much for me personally, too flowery. But that being said, I think overall the juxtaposition between the sciencey aspects of it and this flowery, beautiful prose worked pretty well to tell the story that they were trying to tell. The next book that I read this month was The Whisper Man by Alex North. The Whisper Man follows this dad and his son Jake, and the mother has just died, and they decide to move to this new town to get a fresh start. And so they move into this house only to kind of discover that a young boy at the same age as Jake has very recently gone missing. And at the same time, we're following Pete and Amanda, who are these two detectives who are working on this case of this missing boy. And it's about this father and son who are struggling to connect after the mother has died. And it's a thriller. It's terrifying. I couldn't listen to it with the lights off at night. I had to keep the lights on because it was so scary. The characterizations were all really interesting. You didn't love them because they were perfect. You loved them because of the flaws that made them human. And you were so terrified for them the entire time. And you just didn't know it was happening, 50% of the time. There were so many plot twists and surprises. And I personally was surprised by 90% of the things that happened. Yet every single one of those plot twists and surprises felt purposeful and deliberate and believable. I give this book a 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I get scared very easily, so I had to listen to it either during the day or with the lights on. But, you know, the fact that I had to go through all those lengths is an indication that it was a very good thriller. So that's all I can say about that. Okay, and then the final book that I read this month was On Writing, a memoir by Stephen King. And On Writing kind of follows both Stephen King's story and his relationship with writing throughout his life, and also his suggestions for up-and-coming writers. There are things about this book that I agree with and things about it that I don't agree with, and parts that I liked and parts that I didn't like. I think sometimes he comes off a little bit high and mighty or snooty, where I always feel a little bit wary of writers who give advice in this very definitive way of like, you should never do this thing, you should definitely do this thing. You know, if you're a bad writer, you'll never become a good writer. If you're a good writer, you'll never become a great writer. Just give up now, it doesn't even matter. Like, saying things as if they are the grand arbiter of what cannot be, when they're only one person and one writer out of so many writers who've experienced life totally differently. And so I think that if you take his advice and his words with a grain of salt, where if there are things that seem a little bit absurd to you, just take them as absurd and ignore them. But then the things that really resonate with you, if you take those and try to insert that into your daily practices, I think that that's a good way to approach this book. And that's kind of how I try to approach the book. I think there's some really solid writing advice in there, even if there are some kind of absurd definitive claims that I don't agree with. I think overall I'd probably give this book like a 3.5 out of 5, but he did definitely have some really helpful, really interesting writing advice that I'm going to try to use to motivate myself to write more and to write better. So, you know, all in all, it was definitely a book worth reading, even if I don't agree with all of it. So yeah, interestingly, this is the first Stephen King book I've ever read. I've never read a single one of his thrillers, but I'm definitely excited to pick them up because he does talk about them a little bit and the ideas that bore all of his different books, and so I am really excited to pick up a lot of his books now. Hey, Editing Anisha here. Just to let you know, I forgot to mention this, he deeply spoils, like, a lot of his books in this book. So you can do what I did, which is try to skim the parts where he's spoiling stuff and hope that you kind of forget stuff, which I think I've done, so maybe that was for the best, or maybe read some of his books you're more excited about before going into this book, so that you don't spoil the vast majority of his body of work by reading his memoir before you read his books, like I did. Okay, that's all. So those are the books that I read in August. I think my favorites were Daisy Jones and the Six and Stories of Your Life and Others. I had a pretty good reading month overall, all things considered. Definitely had a very good reading week. That's all I have to say. Thank you for joining me in this much more aesthetically pleasing space. See you next time. Bye.